I'm going to go back to where Scrum began, and I have to say, where Scrum began for me is maybe different for others. It actually occurred in 1967. I was flying missions over North Vietnam in an F-4. And so every day I had a project. I had to plan the project. I had to plan the timing. I had to plan to execute the project successfully. And as I crossed over the border into North Vietnam, it was the most heavily defended airspace in the history of aerial warfare. We were getting shot at 100% of the time. And so the plan had to be executed to evade risk. It had to be built on risk avoidance every second you were over North Vietnamese airspace. And so I adopted an evasive maneuver that was executed crossing the border, and it never ended until I got back over the border. But in the middle, I had to hit the target. Now, I noticed many years later, I'll go forward to when I got into software development. I noticed that software projects had similar problems. Every day I would come into work and there would be something that was trying to shoot that project down. And the style of managing those projects was not effective at dealing with the problems. So, in Vietnam, only 50% of the pilots I flew with got shot down. But in the projects, particularly in the big banks where I worked, 83% of the projects would fail, okay? So I realized they needed the same kind of risk avoidance mechanisms that was built into fighter aircraft. So let's say from even before the 1967 till about 1975, I was in the Air Force flying high-performance jets. The other thing I noticed when I got into the big banks is that not only were projects failing, but the people didn't have a way to understand how to me, it was looking like they were trying to land a project on an aircraft carrier. The land was kind of moving on them as they're trying to land that project, and they didn't have the tooling to understand where they were. If you think about how a high-performance jet has to land on an airplane, there's many different things you need to know. You need to know your airspeed. You need to know how far away the runway is. You need to know your rate of descent. You need to know the angle of attack of the aircraft, because depending on how pitched up that nose is, you can get into a place where it takes more power to go slower. See, I saw that happening on the waterfall projects. It's called Brooks' Law. If you take a big project and it's late and you add more people, it gets later, and then the project crashes. Now, fortunately, when you're flying fighters, you produce a big black burning hole in the ground, so it gets people's attention. But for some reason, when the big project fails at the bank, people don't learn from the experience. They still keep those projects crashing all the time. So, let me tell you how I got into the bank. I actually went from the Air Force I became a professor of medicine in a medical school. Interesting transition. And from 1975 to 1986, I was funded by the National Cancer Institute to study biological systems, and particularly how does a human cell work and how is it transformed into a malignant state. And my job was to work with some of the people that were my advisors were the leading scientists on the planet, and our job was to actually establish why cancer occurs, because people didn't even know it at that time. And by 1980, we had established the model, which is now the standard model for thinking about how cancer occurs. And to mathematically model that occurrence in the human cell and translate that model such that it would be predictive of data on all the data in cancer patients that we had in the United States. The first time I ran that model, it took a third of the computer science budget for my department in the university for a year, and they told me I could never run that model again. So I had to get creative. And I worked with the head of the medical computing laboratory, a physician who was acquiring new technologies, and we got a fault-tolerant system, a system which was being used in the big banks for automated teller systems, but it had a unique characteristic, two really unique characteristics. It never went down. It was fault-tolerant. But it also had an architecture that enabled me to grab every spare cycle of every CPU, and there were multiple CPUs, without disturbing normal production. So for 5 years, I grabbed every spare cycle on multiple processors to get my PhD. Now, at that time, a banking company that was running 150 banks across North America came by, and they said, okay, at the university, you guys have, all the knowledge, but almost no money. But over at the bank, we don't know what we're doing, and we have all the money. So why don't you come on over to the bank, and help us out? We'll make you the vice president of advanced systems. You can lead us into the future. And they said, and we'll make you an offer that your wife can't refuse. which they did. She agrees, they did. And so I wind up at the bank, okay? How many of you are bankers in here, work in banks? There's a lot of them in Zurich, okay? So I wind up in the bank, and the first thing I notice is they have hundreds of COBOL programmers. Do you still have COBOL programmers here in Zurich? Few of them still left. And I was looking at what they were doing, and I noticed all their projects were late. Are your projects still late? And when they were late, the management would get upset, and they would put pressure on the developers. And when they put pressure on the developers, it just made it worse. They just got later, and the customers were really unhappy. Now, I had spent 11 years modeling complex systems and was an expert on systems theory. And so I looked at this thing called running software development in a bank as a system. And any system has certain stable states in a state space, and this was one of them. And I noticed that no matter what the management did, they just reinforced this state of late, unhappy people, pressure, unhappy customers. Everything the management did made it worse. And I couldn't believe what they were doing. I said, either these people are crazy or I'm crazy. I need to figure this out. Because I had never worked in software other than with my own team writing my own software. And we had to solve really hard problems, which we never would have solved using this system, which is a complete failed system. Okay? So for the next 10 years, I tried experiments. I went through 4 companies where I was head of engineering, and we tried experiments to try to break out of this stuck pattern. What I was trying to get to is, I thought that projects should always be early. And, we should be kind to the management. They should get all their bonuses. But the developers should be having fun. Software development, I went into software development because it was fun. It was interesting, okay? So that's what it should be. And the customers, they should be ecstatic. They should like your banking software like they like their iPhone, okay? That's what we want. But how to get there? Because To go from one stable state to another, you have to cross a region that is unstable. There's a lot of chaos out there. So you have to, first of all, inject energy into the system that's broken. And the first level of energy we injected in had to do with what I learned from 15 years of working with entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. How they started up entrepreneurial teams, brought out new companies, took them public, and cashed out. And I worked with many of them who had retired in their 30s, never had to work again in their lives, and they were trying to figure out how to make the world a better place. And they were doing by building high-energy teams, just like they did in the software business. So we noticed that most teams, everybody is headed in a little different direction than the other person. You know, some people are headed forwards, some people are headed sideways, some people are headed backwards. And if you can figure out how to align the team, get them all agreed on a central direction, they can immediately double their performance by working less, simply because everybody is headed in the right way. And once you get that going, then people actually feel that what they're doing is constructive. They feel like they're working together. They start feeling good about one another. And then you can start building team spirit into the equation, just like you do in sports teams. And as soon as you start building that team spirit, you can double productivity again. So what I was interested in is building teams that could build so much software so fast, the managers and the customers would be saying, you have to slow down. It's too much. It's like drinking from a fire hose. Okay. So I knew it was possible. It was just a way to figure out the mechanism. Now, it took until 1993. I was actually hired into a company called ESE Corporation in 1993. Not as a VP of engineering. They were actually recruiting a VP of engineering, but the CEO, a guy named Doug Kahn, had just acquired a software company, actually a German company, a German small-talk compiler company. And he had bought that company to take his products to the next level. ESE was, I believe, the first fourth-generation language company in the business, and they were getting increasing competition from companies like PowerSoft, and they needed to ramp the technology to the next level. And they thought object-oriented tooling was the way to go, and so they went up and bought a small-talk company. But the question was then, what were the tools? And that was my job. My job was to create a tool set and do it in 6 months that would bring out a new product that would replace all of their legacy products. They didn't know what the new product was. They just knew it had to be twice as good and twice as fast as anything they'd ever done. And Doug said, Jeff, you've launched a lot of new technologies. And we've got 10 guys that can be VP of engineering, but nobody that could take this unknown product and deliver it in record time. And we think that you could do that if you're willing to come in and take a small team of 5 or 6 people and figure it out. So I was hired in kind of like a chief engineer at Toyota. Build this new car and do it really fast. And on the way, figure out what it should be. So off we went. The first thing we did, as I had done with many new technologies, object database technologies, information retrieval on the internet, several different things, the first thing we needed to do was review all the literature in the computer science journals and research papers to know everything that had ever been done so that we could take it beyond. And it always seemed to take about 1,000 carefully studied papers before you got to the end of what was already available. It turned out in this case, we reviewed 30 years of IBM systems journals. And then we started wading through everything. On about the 300th paper, we came across a paper by 2 Japanese guys who were visiting professors at Harvard Business School. And it was unusual because it was published in the Harvard Business Review, not in a computer journal. And in there, Professors Takeuchi and Nanaka talked about going all around the world looking at best teams. What did they see that really worked? And they noticed that the teams that really worked really reminded them of sports teams, and rugby in particular. And in particular, the scrum formation in rugby. They worked they were all linked together, moving the ball forward down the field and working around or overcoming any impediment that got in the way with intensity and focus. And they had seen this in many Japanese manufacturing companies, consumer product companies, a couple of US companies that were not software companies. So we looked at this paper, and they described the style of how management set up such a team, and how they invested in such a team, and how they treated such a team. And we looked at that, and they said, the whole team said, that is exactly what we need for software development. It'll provide us a formal model to produce high-performing teams. And Takeuchi and Nanaka had called that style of project management Scrum. Scrum project management. Now, it's interesting because that was in 1993, and I never met Professor Nanaka until this January. I went to Tokyo specifically to meet Professor Nanaka. And in that time, Nanaka has actually become what many people argue is the leading management guru in the planet. He's replaced Peter Drucker, the guy who invented the concept of management. And he is tremendously fascinated that his work, largely in Japanese manufacturing and management theory, has been implemented on a huge scale in software all over the planet. And so we spent a good time together, and then he said, when you go back to Boston, Professor Takeuchi is back at the Harvard Business School. And Professor Takeuchi had been the dean of the Hitsusabashi Business School for 20 years in Tokyo, and was forced to retire by hitting the retirement age. And so he went back to Harvard. So we get back there, and the first thing he wants me to do is teach his class at the Harvard Business School, which I did with my wife Arlene last Friday. We got together with the Harvard Business School students. And I find that he's teaching a different style of management to the Harvard students that's a counterpoint. All this strategy and driving companies by the numbers might have some value, except that it's not really how it works. If you go in and look at the best companies, how they started, how they became great, it's all about the people. It's all about inspecting and adapting. It's all about being surprised by success and then taking advantage of it. And he's trying to introduce Scrum into the curriculum in Harvard Business School. And this example he has of large-scale deployment in software is a nice tool for him to add to his arsenal, okay? So that paper, Scrum, was created directly from that Takeuchi and Nanaka paper, the first Scrum team. And we formed the team. It was based on all the knowledge that I had gotten from working with Bell Labs for many years, also working with people at MIT, particularly the Media Laboratory at MIT. We knew certain things were really important. For example, Bell Labs had removed all titles from development teams based on 10 years of research on best teams in the world. They found what was it that made teams perform well. And they discovered that it was the way the individuals communicated with one another and how they interacted. This is the first principle of the Agile Manifesto: individuals and interactions over processes and tools. We didn't just make that up. There's 10 years of Bell Labs research that show that is what's most important, okay? So once they understood that, they came up with a metric to calculate it called communication saturation. Then they went out and did 200 case studies in companies all over the world and got hundreds of data points on every company and did regression analyses to figure out, okay, what is it that cripples communication saturation and brings performance down? And they found the major thing is specialized roles and silos of information. That's what destroys productivity. And so they said at Bell Labs, we're not going to have that. Everybody is going to be a member of the team. So we already had that before we looked at Takeuchi Tanaka, but Takeuchi Tanaka had a formal way of setting up these teams. And when the team looked at that and said, you know, we had a who should be the team leader and what would we call them, we decided the Scrum Master because it was going to be Scrum. And we started the first Scrum team, actually started Scrumming in January of 1994. We worked this all out in the fall of 93. The first Scrum team started Scrumming in 1994. About the middle of the first month of Scrumming, we kept on researching, reading, studying, and we were looking for, you know, Takeuchi Tanaka teams were not software teams. We were looking for really high-performing software teams. And what was the highest performing software team in the world? We found it. It was a team at Borland. They were building Quattro Pro at the time, which was a Excel spreadsheet kind of product before Excel existed. And those 8 guys at Borland were delivering software at the rate of 400 guys at Microsoft. 8 guys were worth 400 guys. And it was all because their communication saturation was so high. They were the highest team on the communication saturation metric in hundreds of companies. And we said, what was it that made that communication saturation so high? And in the paper, it was written by Jim Copeland, who's now working within the Scrum community. He showed that it was a daily meeting that a cross-functional team had. Everybody, every day, all the developers, all the testers, the product marketing people were there. Often the CEO was there, Philip Kahn at the time. Every day. And at Borland, it was usually at least an hour. And we said, in order to achieve that high-performing state, we have to have a daily meeting. The whole team decided that the same day, and the next day we started. So it was about the second monthly sprint that we started the daily meeting. And when we did that, we found that an hour was too long. We didn't like a long daily meeting, so we really worked at how do we get it shorter? What is the shortest possible meeting we can get? And what needs to happen in the meeting? And by within about a month, we had gotten it down to 15 minutes. And what we realized is that everybody needed to know everything that was going on, and everybody needed to know how to help each other, and then actually do it, help each other. We needed to figure that out in the daily meeting every day. So that meeting got wound up in the second sprint. We started up in the third sprint. We planned for a month's work based on our velocity in the second sprint. And at the end of 1 week, we were done. And it was a huge surprise. People said, what happened? The team had gone into a hyperproductive state. It's always a surprise. But when that happened, we knew we were onto something. And I had to act immediately when that happened. The team then was immediately going so fast. I had to go out and get someone to help me in figuring out how we were going to target this product properly for the market. I needed someone that I could put out half the time in the marketplace, half the time in the team, explaining exactly the priority of the features that needed to be delivered, because in 3 months we were going to deliver, and we were going to be delivering 12 times as much functionality as I thought we were going to be able to deliver. So I went to product marketing. I got the best guy out of product marketing. I said, come on, you're going to be over. You're going to be over working with the team. Your job is to own the prioritization of the product backlog and be there in the market, look at the competition, work with the team every day you're in town, make sure they understand what we need to do to make this product the best product that the market has seen when it hits the marketplace. So the goal of Scrum from the beginning was to get 5 to 10 times productivity. What most people do using Scrum today don't fully understand yet, because they haven't experienced or achieved this state, is that Scrum is a disruptive technology that if you implement it well, your competition can't compete. And you will put your competitors out of business. That's what it's for. That's why I spend a bunch of my time working with a venture capital group. That's what they want to do. They say, Jeff, don't go work for those banks in Zurich. We want you, our job is to start up small companies and put those big ones out of business. You're just helping our competition by helping these big companies, okay? So we know systematically now how to do this with every team. Because of my work with the venture guys, they really push me to document exactly how you can take every team hyperproductive. And we know exactly how to do it now. Just simply, we know that getting software done and tested inside a short iteration will double productivity. Test it at the feature level so an end user can evaluate it. If a team can do that, they will double performance. We know that if the product backlog, what they're building, is in a ready state, it's clear, it's prioritized properly, it's in small pieces, it's estimable, it's testable by the team, it's well understood so there's not a lot of questions and confusion, that will double their productivity again. We know they can go 4 times as fast. And I've defined that arbitrarily as the beginning of the hyperproductive state. But we find that most teams doing Scrum are not doing that. They're not done at the end of the sprint. Their product backlog is not good. So most teams go into what we call a slow Scrum state, okay? Now, the good news about this is that even slow Scrum is better than this failed system we call waterfall. At Yahoo, after we booted up 250 Scrum teams, 50 of them were well-trained, well-coached. They were running at 300 to 400% of what the rest of the teams were doing. But even the other 200 teams, they got a 35% improvement. That 35% improvement for Yahoo was $200 million of free money every year, just by running a lousy Scrum, okay? So most of the work that I'm doing these days, since there's so many people doing Scrum now, I work mainly people who've already been doing Scrum for a year or two, and we're trying to get them from this slow state to the fast state, because that's where the fun begins, okay? People that are on these kind of teams, I'll just close by saying I was in France. France is an interesting company to try to introduce Scrum. They're so bureaucratic. They have so many managers. But I was teaching in Paris, and I had a guy at the table on a team that was working on software from BMWs. And all the rest of his guys in our team was like, Scrum will never work in our company. But I said to this guy that it was actually a Siemens subsidiary. And I asked this guy, well, how does your Scrum team work? And he starts choking up, and tears come to his eyes, and he says, I can't tell you the exhilaration I feel. It's changed my life. And he wouldn't say anything else. He just shut up. So my hope for all of you who are interested in this, that one day you will experience that exhilaration. But to do it, that's the hard part, and that's what Ken is going to talk about.